We are accustomed to our own technology and find it difficult to recognize that the ancients may have had sophisticated technology of their own. Since the technology of the ancients is not obvious to us, are we looking in the wrong place? Could it be they had power systems, but they were entirely different from ours today? Looking at the architecture of structures from ancient Egypt stimulates a sense of wonder. Clearly, Egyptian monuments rival the grandeur of our most modern buildings today. Yet we are taught to believe that we are the ones with knowledge of high technology, something the ancients could not possibly have had.
As long as we think that the ancients weren't able to use high technology, then we're not looking for it. And yet, the evidence is right in front of our eyes.
We find megalithic sites everywhere around the world. So there's certain things in common that they all seem to know, and we don't know it.
Yeah, a lot of people are trying to figure out why mankind built these structures out of these huge megalithic stones. We don't even know how to move 200, 300-ton stones very well today, let alone 4,000 or 5,000 years ago.
I started looking at megalithic structures from an electromagnetic point of view. And sure enough, I began to find that there were these energies there present in measurable forces.
Strange things happen sometimes in sacred sites, and those are clues that the physics that we're taught in school is not everything.
For thousands of years, the pyramids and the Sphinx stood as sentinels on the open desert. Yet, in recent years, a 20-mile wall, 14 feet high, was installed around the enormous site of the Giza Plateau. There are about 100 armed guards patrolling the pyramids at night. Applications for investigative academic research, while entertained initially, are almost all routinely refused. Unlike in times past, tourists are now being restricted from taking photographs in the Egyptian Museum. The monuments of Egypt are World Heritage Sites. Why is access and legitimate scientific research being systematically restricted? Much of ancient Egypt remains undiscovered. Satellite images show traces of buried structures that are still not excavated. In the name of protecting sites, are Egyptian authorities preventing us from learning the truth about our ancient past? Despite strict regulations on what kind of research is allowed, there is still an extraordinary amount of evidence that shows that the ancient Egyptians had knowledge that has been lost.
We don't have the technology to build the pyramids now. Not even close. We're not the most evolved we've ever been. And that is one of the blinders that has stopped us from imagining that the ancients could have been far smarter than us.
Hakim Awian was raised by indigenous elders who lived in the area of the Band of Peace. Having preserved the ancient Suf language, stories were passed down generation after generation. Fragments of knowledge from the ancient past were thus preserved.
If my colleague, the scholar, who learned to say that the Egyptians have a piece of rope, put it around a block of stone, at least 60-ton weight, and pulled and pushed by animals and run on wooden blocks. This is what the scholars are saying.
We may never be exactly sure how the pyramids were built. Yet we can begin to reconstruct our understanding of the culture living in the Golden Age and their values. Traditional Egyptology insists that the pyramids were built by slaves to feed the egos of kings. Does this fit with our emerging construct of Egypt in a golden age?
There is no slavery. All workers are willingly pyramids builder. This is a qualified people of architecture, engineers, and they deal with all the power, like cutting stones, transfer it, and use it. And that is clear, not only in the pyramids and in the temple walls and many places. You can see that clearly.
There are clues throughout Egypt that point to knowledge of high technology. A fascinating thing occurred when a chunk of stone recently fell off a lintel at Abydos Temple, and controversial images resembling a helicopter and other advanced-looking vehicles were revealed under the stone. It would seem that the images were covered in the distant past when things were changing politically in Egypt. Nowadays, Egyptian tour guides are explicitly instructed not to point these out to tourists. The Egyptological explanation is that it is multiple hieroglyphs overlapping from distant kings' inscriptions. But, like many things in Egypt, the explanation is still debatable. Another controversial object that Egyptologists merely deem impossible is the artifact commonly known as the Baghdad Battery, that generates a mild electrical charge. Similar ancient artifacts that match these objects have been found in Egypt. We can't say for certain, but it would appear that the Egyptians documented the existence of these artifacts as well. Recreations of these objects have been made and have successfully created electric current. Also noteworthy are strange representations of objects that resemble light bulbs, found in the crypts at Dendera. There was no natural light inside these underground crypts, but we see no soot from torches or oil lamps, the only lights we know the ancients used. Could the ancient Egyptians have had their own source of electrical power? If nothing else, the ancients had to cut, move, and lift massive stone blocks that would challenge our engineers today. What was their secret? We automatically assume that ancient structures are for ceremonial and religious purposes. Maybe the pyramids served a completely different function than previously imagined.
There's been lots of speculation about what the pyramids were actually built for. The most accepted notion is that they were tombs.
Much more complicated situation with the Great Pyramid than most people understand or most people believe, including a lot of Egyptologists who see it simply as a tomb for the pharaoh Khufu.
That idea is childish for the following reason. I mean, it's obvious, we don't find mummies in the pyramids.
And of course, not finding a single mummy in any of the pyramids doesn't seem to deter the people who think that that's what they were for.
Yes, there's something that's sometimes referred to as a stone sarcophagus or coffer in it, a beautiful granite structure, but that doesn't prove definitively in my mind that it was ever actually used for a tomb. It may have been used for many other purposes.
Pyramids were built not as a tomb. There are some pyramids built in a different construction, like the one in Saqqara, Step Pyramid, that is tomb.
Look at the obvious difference in construction between the Step Pyramid and the Great Pyramid. The difference in style of construction would logically indicate they were built in different time frames. The buildings we know to be tombs, like the Step Pyramid at Saqqara and the flat-topped mastabas, also at Saqqara, are very different from the smooth-sided pyramids at Giza and Dashur. Typically in Egypt, older constructions are built of larger stones. New constructions are built of smaller stones. Also, in archaeology, older structures are deeper. Newer structures are found closer to the surface. Every other tomb that has been found is highly decorated with names of the occupant. The inside of these pyramids seems solely functional and not decorative at all.
But if we stop altogether and say, okay, if they weren't tombs, what were they?
What are the biggest structures that modern man builds on the planet? The biggest, most awe-inspiring structures we create are hydroelectric dams. Why are we willing to invest such awe-inspiring amounts of labor and effort in constructing those? Because we know we're going to get a very valuable physical return in the form of electricity. And by comparison, I wonder if the ancient megalith builders weren't willing to invest such staggering amounts of resources by even smaller populations because they knew that they could get something very physical and worthwhile back from it.
People are fascinated by Egyptian monuments, and some report the energy is palpable at these sites. Is it possible to confirm this energy through scientific means?
What I've been finding in the last 20 years of research is a lot of experiments that have been done that show that there's a certain type of energy that does not exist in our current science. It's unknown with our current science. We call it subtle energy.
Well, this is a whole new trend of thought in looking at ancient structures, that maybe the ancients understood subtle energies.
So this appears to be a technology that may have existed in megalithic societies. You know, these societies that built things out of big stones.
It makes sense that you could motivate an entire population to invest so heavily in building these structures, I think. And I don't mean to say by any means that this is the only purpose of the megaliths, but I think it's pretty clear that it's at least one of the primary or one of the important purposes for building these structures.
We find megalithic sites everywhere around the world, and there's a tendency to make circles or certain types of formations.
Megalithic sites occur all over the world. Is their placement random, or does the location of these sites reveal yet another hidden layer of ancient knowledge?
One thing I've found looking at different megalithic structures over a few continents and numerous places around the world, overwhelmingly these places, the pyramids, the Stonehenges, etc. of the world, were placed on ground where an unusual type of geology naturally concentrates the regular daily natural electromagnetic fluctuations that occur everywhere on the Earth each day.
If you go into England, for example, the ley lines that cross England, the Michael Line, which is hundreds of miles long, that crosses England, that carries this energy along that line.
It will therefore generate electric currents in the land called telluric currents in the straight geological sense of that word. And those occur everywhere on the planet.
But we know that this ley energy, this subtle energy, passes along these lines.
There are certain special types of geology that will magnify those several-fold. And that's where we found the megalith builders preferred to put their monuments.
And typically where lines cross, where you get more than one line intersecting, temples were often built.
These are called conductivity discontinuities, which sounds highly technical, but it's merely the place where one area of ground that has a good ability to conduct electricity meets another area of ground that has a lesser ability to conduct these natural electric currents.
The Chinese had the same tradition. They call them dragon lines. It was illegal for a commoner to be buried on such a line. A king had to be buried on such a line. They put palaces there. There's a whole series of sacred sites that were always built on lines like this.
I want to say in this area about the location of temples. You have to have symbols appear on the ground. When it's seen, then this is the place where people naturally come to get more healthy energy from that spot. You know, energy pops from the earth.
And it appears as though they were attempting to control the flow of this energy and use it for their own purposes.
The key hours, unfortunately, are the pre-dawn hours. If you really want to study this, you've got to get up at 3 and get out there very fast. It's because the energy that's involved in these sites, that's really fueling most of it, originates with the daily changes in the Earth's geomagnetic field. It's strongest during the day, weakest at night. And in the hours leading up to dawn, the weaker field lines now come roaring back to closer to full strength very quick. It's the most dramatic time in terms of change of magnetic strength per hour. It's the most dramatic time of the day. And wherever you have a changing magnetic field occurring, you are generating electric current in anything present that will conduct electricity. It's a simple principle of physics known as induction, and it's a universal.
Normally, in everyday life, we don't ever see large concentrations of this energy. Normally, it'll show up at, say, at mountaintops, at sacred sites. You'll feel a certain calm, a certain peace. Sometimes people in those places report mystical experiences. They'll see into some other dimension, okay? They'll see into some other time. The Chinese have known about this for a long time, and they call it qi. The Hindus, in their ancient texts, call it prana. And the yogis, that maintain a very ancient tradition, use it. It affects a variety of different processes. Electricity and magnetism has a strong effect on that. So it modifies all the other laws of physics. When you look back on how sacred sites were chosen and buildings like the pyramids were constructed, the suspicion arises that they understood quite a bit more about this stuff than we do, and they may have been using it in their engineering.
Then the megalith builders designed these structures and then built them in such a way as to further concentrate those energies. So they definitely seem to have known what they were doing.
We are not used to things built out of stone being high technology. It is clear that several different kinds of stone from a variety of sources were used to construct Egyptian monuments. Did the distinct qualities of the stones serve a special purpose?
What I do find fascinating is that the core of the pyramids, at least at Giza, are made out of one type of limestone. Now, it is the limestone that was closest, but it also happens to be the type that's called dolomite, because it's got a high magnesium content. And because of that metal content, that kind of limestone conducts electricity pretty well. And then they chose to sheath the pyramid in the whiter Tura limestone, which, granted, it's whiter and it's prettier and all that, but it also has almost zero magnesium content. And therefore, it's a much poorer conductor of electricity. It's closer to a pure calcium carbonate, which is what all limestone is. And pure calcium carbonate conducts electricity much more poorly than dolomite does. It's interesting to me that those outer stones were the ones that they cut so precisely that all these thousands of years later you still can't get a razor blade between them. Because basically what we've got here is we've got a situation with a highly electrically conductive core of those pyramids wrapped in what is effectively a very effective insulator. Why the granite in the passageways, you know? And so of course I'm thinking from an electrical point of view and a physical point of view. Is there anything special about granite? And yeah, there is. Granite is slightly radioactive, and it will ionize or electrify the air. It releases radon gas, which is radioactive.
Granite is a transmission stone. It's not dead stone, it's alive.
So you have these sealed shafts with granite linings, and I wonder if it wasn't designed to keep an electrical charge present in those shafts. They were built exactly like, if you will, an insulated wire, only more so because you've got all the charge in the ground that's spread across the base, concentrated all the way up into this tiny spot at the top.
We find similarities in 3 different constructions. The one at Giza here, Valley Temple, and one at Abydos, and another one abroad in England, the Stonehenge.